Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight's event on David Livingstone and how Scotland presents the White Saviour complex. My name's Ross McGregor and I'm the Heritage Lead at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. Tonight's event is live, so apologies in advance for any variation in the sound and visual quality. It does sometimes happen. The event is also being recorded, so please switch off cameras and microphones. And the chat area is enabled. If you haven't used Teams before, it's up at the top of your screen and there's a little speech bubble that says show conversation, so you can see the chat there. And please feel free to type in any questions or comments as we go. And we'll come to these later on in the event. My colleagues Claire and Kirsty are on hand as well and will assist with any questions and queries. So yeah, just remind everyone when you're entering to turn off cameras and turn off microphones. So we're joined tonight by three very special guests, Zandra, Elena and Kate. If you'd all like to introduce yourselves.
So hi there, I'm Zandra Yeaman. I'm currently on secondment from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights to the Hunterian Museum as their curator of Discomfort.
Hi, I'm Kate Simpson. I'm a lecturer in Information Studies at the University of Glasgow. I'm a trustee of the David Livingstone Birthplace Trust in Blantyre, and I'm a project scholar for Livingstone Online.
Evening, everyone. I'm Elena Tremarchi and I work at the David Livingstone Birthplace. I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager there.
Great, thanks for that. And we're really grateful for the three of you joining us tonight. So thank you again, really appreciate it. So we're doing these reframed events to help us reveal our heritage in new ways, to address issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. We're reframing our heritage by acknowledging that race and gender inequality is embedded in our history. Heritage practice, and by that I mean museum displays, engagement and so on, connects people to the past, but often ignores inequalities that are part of the story. The college has celebrated its Livingstone heritage since the late 19th century, when his celebrity as a missionary and explorer became part of British culture. The way we tell our Livingstone story is captured in the Victorian frame of empire, exploration and white privilege, barely evolving these past 120 years. In 2021, we want to look more closely at the context of this heritage, discuss it and reframe it. So I'm just going to give a wee bit of background about Livingstone and the college. Livingstone got his licence to practice medicine from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow in 1840, the year before he left on his first expedition to Africa. He studied medicine at Anderson's University and in London teaching hospitals, and then he sat the licentiate examination at the college. When he returned to Scotland briefly in the 1850s, he was awarded honorary fellowship of the college, as well as many other honours across the UK, which reflected his growing fame. So we have a number of collections in the college that relate to David Livingstone. So hopefully you can see those slides now. So the college's Livingstone collections are not extensive, but we have a few items in the college relating to Livingstone. So the picture here is of the licentiate diploma from the college from 1840. Livingstone had to pass the college's licentiate examination in order to practice medicine. Another item that we have, which is one of our more significant items, is the portrait by Thomas Annan, which is pictured. This is based on a photograph that Annan took of Livingstone in 1864. And this portrait was purchased by the college in 1875 and still hangs on the college walls. Probably has done continuously, I would say, since 1875. We have other collections as well, lots of book collections, first editions of Livingstone's books, including the first book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, published by John Murray in 1857. And we also have some items in our museum collection relating to Livingstone. For example, this replica cast of his Left Humerus, which was presented to the college by the Livingstone Memorial Trust in 1973. We have some other items in the collection which aren't pictured, for example, a set of his instruments, a pocket set of his medical and surgical instruments. And we also have a small number of archive material relating to Livingstone as well, some letters. So these collections are regularly displayed in the college. They're used to strengthen its Livingstone connections, and this includes the college's contemporary connections to Malawi and to the broader global health agenda. And we'll come back to some of these issues about the college's collections and what we do with them as we go further into the discussion. But first of all, I'm going to pass over to Zandra now, who's going to speak for a bit about Livingstone and about White Saviour Complex, specifically to Scotland. So I'll pass over to you, Zandra.
That's great, Ross. Thanks very much. So thank you, Ross, and thank you for inviting me along to speak today in your collection of Reframe Conversations. And to be honest, there really is no comfortable way to discuss our topic today about Scotland and how it presents the White Saviour complex, particularly as we've only got 15 minutes. So if you are feeling uncomfortable, in particular when you're seeing a slide like this, don't worry, because that's actually a good thing. And in Scotland, the personal and specific historical context belonging to people of African, Caribbean and Asian descent linked to empire, transatlantic slavery, colonialism and migration, each of which have an extensive impact on Scotland's economic, demographic, environmental, cultural and social development. Despite this, the histories of these communities are not acknowledged and represented as well as they should be within education, within history, heritage, arts and culture work in Scotland today. And how we represent our history has an influence in all areas of life in Scotland to some degree, from social attitudes to the way organisations are run, permitting inequalities for Black and minority ethnic people to continue over generations. And to understand the Scotland's White Saviour complex, we need to understand concepts such as white supremacy and look at it not from the perspective of flag-waving white supremacists in the south of the US, but thinking about it as a political, economic and cultural system in which white Western ideals control the power of the text, the material resources and ideas of cultural superiority. And again, looking at concepts around white privilege, the privilege doesn't mean that you have not came across any barriers in life or that you're privileged in a sense of a monetary value. But what it is about how privileged white people, white communities and culture are centred in our society, and how the colour of your skin is not a barrier to that. And this is valued above others, leading to white people having unequal and unfair access to opportunities and resources compared to Black minority ethnic people in this country. And we have to think about concepts like white fragility. Why do we feel uncomfortable when we talk about these concepts? The defensiveness, the denial and the resistance. And we need to find a way to shift our thinking from the individual to the systematic oppressive structures that continue to be perpetuated today. And how through historical narratives that centre the good white people in the story continuing to omit the atrocities, the stories of resilience and the resistance to colonisation, and how they ignore the effect that this has in our present day. So I thought a good way to show one of our historical narratives that most people growing up in Scotland will know about is David Livingstone, and look at how he is represented and how Scotland uses David Livingstone to distance itself from its complicity within the transatlantic slave trade. So I must credit a former colleague, Marenka Thompson-Odlum, for the work that she did for the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights on deconstructing Livingstone, and of course Dr. Stephen Mullen for his continued research in Scotland's links with the transatlantic slave trade, both people that I draw on a lot of work from. And one of the things I want to be clear about is I do not seek to diminish Livingstone or Scotland's role in the abolition of slavery. However, it is important to understand that that is not the whole story or where the story even begins, but rather an attempt of a nation to build an identity, one that is not linked to the atrocities of the slave trade. And after the passing of the Emancipation Act in 1834, Scotland soon fashioned themselves champions of the enslaved, the vanguard of the abolitionist movement. And in 1883, a statement from a once strongly anti-abolitionist pro-slavers organisation, the Glasgow West Indies Association, read, "It is to Glasgow's lasting honour that while Bristol and Liverpool were up to their elbows in the slave trade, Glasgow kept out of it. The reproach can never be levelled at our city as it was Liverpool, that there was not a stone in her streets that was not cemented with the blood of a slave." But then if you look at the legacies of the British enslavers on this slide, 18th century Scotland made a great deal of money from slave labour camps. By 1780s, 1/3 were owned by Scots. By 1833, the Scottish population was less than 10% of the whole of the UK population as a whole. In 1833, British government agreed to pay 20 million paid by British taxpayers in compensation to the owners of enslaved Africans. And I calculated this in 2018 as 2.14 billion. And British absentee enslavers received 8 million of that 20 million, which was 40% of the overall compensation. And in 2018, that calculated as 856 million. Now, 15% of that 40% of the absentee enslavers lived in Scotland, and they received 1.2 million of the compensation, and that translated and valued in 2018 is 128 million. And Glasgow and West Coast merchants have taken 10% of that, so that was 800,000 in 1833 of the compensation, and that calculates as 86 million in 2018. So in a span of 50 years, they had seemingly forgotten Scotland's significant role in the transatlantic slave trade. And I think it's really important to recognise that on this day, the 25th March, which is the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, no enslaved African received any compensation. So let's just let that sink in for a moment. So when we think about how did Scotland use David Livingstone to distance itself from its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So as we know, David Livingstone, born 1813, died 1873, was a famous Scottish explorer, a missionary, doctor and abolitionist who's best known for exploring yet uncharted areas of Africa and discovering Mosi-oa-Tunya, which was renamed Victoria Falls. Why did he have to rename it? Let's think about that. He also publicised the horrors of the slave trade and sought to free enslaved Africans and bring Christianity to the masses. Livingstone became a national hero back in Britain, hailed for giving the government insight into the African continent. However, despite his abolitionist stance, Livingstone came to depend on the money of slave traders to fund his missions. And in 1875, 2 years after his death, a competition was held by Glasgow City Council to erect a statue of the famed Scottish explorer. Glasgow-based sculptor John Mossman's statue was selected and erected in George Square in March 1879. The unveiling was a grand affair. during the unveiling speech, Committee Chairman James White of Overton recounted Livingstone's disgust at the institution of slavery in Africa and man's inhumanity to man. And the sheriff proclaimed Livingstone one of Scotland's representative men. If he was anything at all, emphatically he was a Scotchman. He rose from that great body of people who made Scotland great. Now, speeches, newspaper articles and poems paint Livingstone in a heroic light, but more importantly, as heroically Scottish. He becomes a stand-in for perceived Scottish ideals and characteristics, industrious, thrifty, Christian, and a believer in abolitionism. Africa, on the other hand, is depicted as a benighted continent in need of saving. Africa's progress is linked with Scottish determination. Furthermore, Scotland's role in slavery and Africa is completely omitted and rewritten as a triumph of Scotsmen. Now, the story of Livingstone and the scramble for Africa can be further explored with a closer look at the Berlin Conference, and also reflects European sentiment towards Africa and African people. Although the conference occurred 10 years after Livingstone's death, his presence is felt. In 1884, the Berlin Conference marked the official beginning of a colonialism in Africa, colonization in Africa. In his opening speech at the conference, Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of the German Empire, quoted Livingstone, referencing his 3 C's of Christianity, commerce, and civilization. You see, Livingstone believed the 3 C's would end slavery in Africa and free Black people. One of the justifying principles behind colonialism was the need to civilize the backward peoples of Africa. This reasoning is illustrated in the Articles of the Berlin Act of 1885. The 3 C's justification permeated European involvement in Africa well into the 20th century, and was the founding tenets of the Glasgow headquartered African Lakes Corporation that controlled the area of modern-day Malawi for decades. Now, the 3 C's, although an abolitionist in explanation, was in fact deeply rooted in racist ideas of superiority of white religion and culture, and was wholly hegemonic in its approach. For example, Article 6, when mentioning religious freedom, refers only to Christian religious freedom and empowers religions to set up missions and churches with the specific purpose of bringing home the blessings of civilization to the natives. A total disregard for centuries of African civilization before Europeans even came across the African continent. Now, the David Livingstone Memorial statue was moved from George Square in 1959 and now stands in front of Glasgow Cathedral Square. And these images that are part of the David Livingstone statue perfectly illustrate Scotland's long-standing view of its involvement in slavery, which anti-racist activists and scholars have continually challenged. It is from this Scotland is abolitionist movement that this statue is born. Livingstone is depicted as the white saviour of enslaved African people, surrounded by grateful people while spreading Christianity. The African people themselves are stereotypically depicted as scantily clad, pitiful, or doing strenuous work. So first we have Livingstone holding a sextant in the African jungle with a sparsely clothed African man clearing his path with a cutlass. Next, a scene showing an African family of a shackled man, distraught woman holding a baby looking up to Livingstone, hopefully as he reads the Bible. The scene continues with the man freed from his chains and holding a spear, and the woman reading the Bible to her child. The 2 images of the family is centred by the serene Bible-reading Livingstone figure, and these images centre Livingstone as the civilising intellectual hero of the African family. And last, we have an Arab enslaver holding a whip over a half-naked African woman. Scotland has for a long time now represented David Livingstone as the quintessential white saviour or Scottish saviour. However, more than that, he is always depicted in a position of power over the African people. In the family scene, he's the focus of the image, and the Africans are literally and metaphorically looking up to him. In the exploring scene, he's depicted with an instrument of progress and civilization, the sextant. Scientific equipment, in this instance, surveying tools, are not innocuous objects, but objects of empire. Through surveying, mapping, and naming, colonial agents exercise power and Western ideals over the landscape. It is through geographical works by Livingstone and other explorers that the so-called Dark Continent was mapped and thus able to be divided up by the colonial powers at the Berlin Conference in 1884. So in an attempt to reinforce the image of Scotland as abolitionists, the last image depicts the slaver as Arabic, referencing the ongoing East African slave trade controlled by Arabic groups. Of course, when the statue was erected, both the Portuguese and Spanish were still slave traders and owners, but the choice to depict the Arabic slave trade distances slave ownership from white Europeans. The Arab slaver is an other, and therefore cannot be conflated with whiteness, serving to erect a divide between the slave trade and the Scottish consciousness. Slavery thus only becomes a familiar entity within the Scottish imagination in terms of abolition, reinforced by images of White Livingstone reading the Bible to the once enslaved family. Although placed on opposite sides in order to enhance the contrast, the Arab slaver and the explorer images are actually telling a similar story, suggesting that there was a deep disconnect between the imagined Scottish narrative and the reality. And the space in between that disconnects is where the erasure of Scotland's slave history occurs. The more the abolitionist image was solidified, the more the enslaved who built Scotland fade into our history. So how do we confront the white saviour complex moving forward? We could recognise and acknowledge the systems in place and our opposition within them as an important step. We could actively listen and collaborate with communities that we reach out to. We can tackle racism that is embedded within the current structures. Non-racist is not anti-racist. And while that struggle is ongoing, don't give up. And we can do events like this, reframing the conversation to include the uncomfortable, unvarnished truth. And I'll leave it there to leave things open for questions, Ross.
But thank you so much, Sandra. There's so much there to think about, and there's a lot of that we'll certainly put into practice or influence our practice as we go forward with our Livingstone heritage. And there'll be elements of that I think will come up in the conversation that we're just about to have between the three of us. So we have a few questions that the four of us are going to chat about, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience as well. So for the audience, please do feel free to make use of the chat function, put in any questions or comments there that we can come to at the end. So one of the questions that I wanted to focus on links quite a bit to some of the stuff you were saying there about the memorial statue, and particularly the time that it was produced. One of the Livingstone collections that we make use of a lot and have done in the college is the first book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, which has the illustrations in it as well. Even very recently, we reproduce these illustrations to engage people with our Livingstone heritage. We've done so with no reference to the book's context, its reception, its role in the creation of the Livingstone celebrity at that time. And for me, this is a good example of where the museums are not neutral. Philosophy needs to be put into practice, and where we need to change our practice. So the question I want to kind of talk about really is, how do we move beyond these sometimes untouchable collections, with untouchable authority and status that sometimes heritage collections have? So can I put that question to all three of you, really? I don't know who wants to go first.
It's a really interesting idea that things come into a museum and they suddenly become static, immovable objects. I mean, Missionary Travels wasn't something that was created as a single thing by Livingstone in one go. There were loads of hands involved. The book was fundamentally not what he wanted it to be in the first place. He included a lot more language that was human and visceral, and there were veins and there was bluish breast milk, all these things that kind of evidence the humanity of the experience that he was having are removed. And as Zandra was saying, that's that first stage at creating an icon. And even when we get to things such as the images that are in missionary travels, yes, those images that a lot of institutions repeatedly use, there's also those are the images that persist. I can't remember who said the quotation, but it was that there was a copy of Missionary Travels in everyone's home in the UK. No one had read it, but everyone had looked at the pictures. And it's that kind of thing. It's this idea that we make an assumption about representation that wasn't necessarily there to begin with. That's not to say that Livingstone wasn't a very problematic individual even at his time, but there's this extra layer of whitewashing that happens, and we see that then perpetuated when we put these items on display as a static immovable object that doesn't apparently have a biography or a history of its own.
I totally agree with Kate with that. I mean, even the things that I'm saying and using the statue as an example, that wasn't Livingstone. This was the people around him. He was, there was a narrative about him that he had no control over. He wasn't even alive, and this narrative was perpetuated of white superiority. One of the things that I found interesting, particularly around missionaries, was I've been in a museum store and I know curators who maybe are involved in world culture, and then you've got curators who are involved in Scottish history. But actually, when you look at the collections in the store with regards to world culture, it was missionaries that brought them back to Scotland. So I couldn't understand why they didn't connect, because to me, that's part of Scottish history. So I found that quite interesting, and I thought the idea that they were segregated out, I thought was quite fascinating, because it is part of Scotland's history. How did these objects get here in the first place? And I also think when we have objects to display, it's layering the narratives. And I think Eleanor probably has a lot more to say about that, because I know that the David Livingstone Centre and Eleanor and her colleagues have been doing a lot of work around layering the narratives and bringing out the other elements of the story that have consistently been omitted, particularly the involvement of African people who were working with David Livingstone.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a collaborative process as well. Like, someone like, well, all of you, the various areas of research and work that you're doing, these conversations that we're having will, ignite ideas or further conversations. For us as a museum, where we've been working for the last 3 years on a redevelopment project, which is, well, hopefully we're reopening this year. But as Zandra was saying, we've been working really hard on adding those extra layers, but also being quite open about where that information is missing, adding context to the history, which really is essential, obviously. But also that thing of when I suppose, when even little snippets of information are shared or are made available. This isn't a snippet. Livingstone Online is an amazing repository of loads of information, definitely not a snippet, but just an example where you can actually see some of the letters or manuscripts of those kind of first-hand accounts. Those inspire our audiences, our community groups to then reflect. And also, the other week we were part of a race and equality session that was youth-led with the Scotland Malawi partnership, and it was a really interesting conversation, which basically was sparked by just having that information of, this is a publication, this is a letter, who decides what the information is that's presented, and how do institutions like museum make decisions around that. So yeah, lots more to say, I think.
Yeah, I think when you're at the stage that urine becomes renal deposit, to make it polite, you've got to be aware that there is already a barrier being put up. As Andrew's saying, there's stuff that happened after Livingstone died, and he becomes used in a certain way to achieve a certain object. And when we don't then go back and revise that history, we look at Missionary Travels as what it was, which was a hugely successful book that brought an understanding of aspects of Africa into the homes of people in the UK. And I wasn't being flippant with that quote about there being a copy in every home. There really was. So the power of that book as a cultural artifact is huge. And it's not surprising that we've all gone, it is this monolith of Victorian sociocultural kind of understanding of the world, and haven't really challenged it. But part of being able to challenge it is us all being in the same room and going, I've got this, what have you got?
And it's that representation, because it matters, you know, the imagery, you know, that imagery where white superiority is very visible, and well, it's so insidious. And when you think about children in Scotland at school now, you know, when even me, when I was a child, you know, you learned about David Livingstone and slavery and abolition, but you didn't actually learn anything about Scotland's involvement in this. And the imagery that was always presented was very subservient, you know, of African people was very subservient. There was never anything about resistance and resilience, and their own agency and challenging, you know, the African slave trade. There was never any stories being told to us about that, which I think is what we really need to start focusing on, is stories of resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like one of the big I suppose projects throughout the redevelopment has been to, as you were saying, to include those layers of stories of people, but quite often the information that we have is just names, or, you know, sometimes it's community groups, and we've made sure to include those. But what you're talking about is a really, really good point. And yeah, that the fact that actually the agency and resilience and revolt that individuals had or groups had is a really important thing to express.
Thanks for that, all three of you. Yeah, those things relating to how heritage organisations and in some way the heritage profession and museums profession, archive profession, that responsibility to move on from the clinging on to previous practices and previous senses of authority and authority objects, and authority stories. The responsibility to move on from those things is becoming ever more real and kind of clear to people, I think, within the profession, and that's why we're having events like this. And the link between that and working more with communities is very obvious, and I think that sounds like one of the ways that the Birthplace Trust has really kind of moved forward and made progress. So I've got one, I'll kind of move on. I've got one other kind of question that I'll put to the group before we open out to the audience. I wanted just to kind of bring in the whole thing, and it kind of links a bit to what we've been talking about in terms of collaboration and so on. But Livingstone is one of these interesting figures, in a way a bit like our previous subject of a reframed event, Joseph Lister, and definitely a bit like Robert Burns, in terms of there are collections and connections to Livingstone dispersed all across the country and all across countries well beyond Scotland. And that dispersion of collections in a way across different institutions can be problematic, but it can also, I think, provide really great opportunities for collaboration across all those different institutions and bodies and so on that hold collections. So what do you think the opportunities are there for collaborating, particularly when it comes to reframing our heritage relating to Livingstone?
Well, it's really interesting because we have this notion that there should be collections in places, and historically how we've researched is we go to a place that has a collection, and usually you have to get some kind of money or funding or travel somewhere, so you have to make it worth your while to go to that place. With the recent surge in digitization and institutions talking to each other, it's not just the big things now that are being made available to people, it's the small disparate bits. And we don't have to have one big collection to have something that is valuable or worthy. Bringing in these different stories from different places becomes much more feasible when we're engaged with each other and when there is digitization. I mean, particularly with Livingstone, the story of the African people that were involved in his expeditions wasn't not there. He never wrote as a man wandering around Africa, seeing occasionally men and absolutely no women, as he walked across and naming places. There was a much more of a moving community, and he named people such as, well, famously Jacob Chuma and Abdullah Susi, but he worked with Manenko and Halima, and these women are in the narrative, or if people don't have names, they're in the narrative as telling a little snippet. For example, towards the end of his life, there was a little girl that joined the group, and Livingstone was impressed by how well she walked. And she's only there for a couple of pages in a notebook. But I would have never read that notebook had a bunch of institutions not began to work together and share the resources that they had. So someone like me as a researcher, I am looking at the women that were involved in Livingstone's expeditions, by the way. I don't just have that information just kind of held in my head. We're taking advantage of that to tell these stories, to be able to work with colleagues in Africa who have different parts of the story, and to find ways to utilize this moment to show people that these histories aren't denying someone else's history. It's about showing quite how broad the histories we have to tell with the heritage we have in these institutions.
These histories have always been present. What fascinates me is what they've always been present. So why were they never centered? Why was that not the story? And what was the thinking behind not putting that front and center of the story? Telling the actual complete story. And I understand that absolutely you need collaboration for people to kind of share their knowledge, their expertise, their objects, their archives. And we are moving in that direction, which is more exciting than an object. This is this and not being brought to life. I feel the way forward is bringing things to life and having people at the center of it, all people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's that thing of there's, I suppose, two key things that I'm thinking about now, which is the fact you mentioned it earlier that museums can't be static. Like the reframing idea is constant. Like we just need to keep reframing and keep revisiting things to make sure that we remain relevant. But also it's around that authority of heritage institutions and actually saying sometimes that, that you don't know is fine, because that opens the door to people coming in, people's knowledge coming in. So,
and sometimes the information that's not there is a story in itself.
Yeah.
The fact that it isn't there or can't be found, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And that can become part of the story also.
Yeah, and it really brings in that kind of critical thinking element, which is so essential for us. I'm thinking with my kind of learning education hat on as well.
Yes, one of the things about, well, even evidenced by the Robert Burns project recently in Scotland, where kind of institutions all put their hands up and said, "We've got this," and folk went, "Oh my God, look, we've got all this stuff that we didn't necessarily realize." Continuing to do that, I mean, people shouldn't be allowed anymore. Institutions shouldn't be allowed anymore to put stuff in a box because they don't understand it. We don't have enough information on that, so we can't display it. Having, well, I suppose you have to start with a catalogue that is actually an honest representation of what an institution holds, and then building from there and allowing people to come in and engage with what you have and say, actually, this is this, as happened with the David Livingstone Birthplace Trust, when people came in and went, this is what you have. not this, which you think it is. And those conversations, they do start, as you both said, with the human and conversation. It doesn't all have to come from the annals of history, because these things develop and grow over time, and knowledge doesn't necessarily have to come from one particular Western centric form of education.
And I suppose we have to remember, you know, why were museums set up in the first place? They were, you know, there was a political agenda behind it. You know, while people always say museums were meant to be neutral, they were never neutral, ever. They were always political statements. They were always politically putting forward a particular agenda for a nation and for the people in society to think in a particular way. So I can understand why there's lots, I mean, pretty much every museum in Scotland, probably across the UK, but I know in Scotland, really struggle with the data around their collection, because a lot of the times things weren't recorded and things go in and out of fashion. But what I do see is, what, even with events like this, what we are doing is we're just in the first steps. You know, it's been, what, 5 years, I'd say, that we've just been, and we're still at the first step. We've still got a long way to go, I would say. And I think, actually, Eleanor, the work you and your colleagues are doing is a great example how to do it. And I think everybody will be looking at that, which is great.
I think, to be honest, it's yeah, as you say, it is a first step. And when we reopen, it's not, you know, we're not going to stop there. It's kind of, we're going to revisit, we're going to engage with community action research and pay community groups and all that kind of good practice that means that we'll have a better understanding of what our story is about and what the Livingston story and Scotland story is about.
And it's really important to talk about the legacy, like what we're dealing with in present day in society. And I think that, for me, is the most important part of the work that we do.
Great, thanks for that. Loads of great discussion there, and I think the main thing for me of this in terms of collaboration is that we're actually collaborating doing this event, and we didn't collaborate before. So there's progress there straight away from this event. So I think it'd be good to move over to some of the questions that are popping into the chat. We've got a few coming in now, and there's one from Moira, who's asking, how is David Livingstone viewed in Malawi today, and what cultural partnerships are there?
So I suppose David Livingstone is a quite important link between Scotland and Malawi, as everybody knows probably. And in general, I don't have kind of real hard facts, but in general, he's viewed as an important figure who's well respected. And I think I'm curious about the cultural partnerships. So if Moira means like between Scotland and Malawi, we are working on developing some of those with museums over there. And yeah, there's, through the Scotland-Malawi partnership, there's really strong links, both cultural institutions and organizations. So I hope that is enough for now.
That's great. And actually, I've got someone with a hand up who might be saying something that I was about to maybe say as well. So Mike, do you want to chip in with the partnerships between Malawi?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ross. I think it was fascinating to me the first time I visited Malawi to understand just how revered Livingstone was in Malawi. It was quite extraordinary. Because, so thank you, first of all of you, for your discussion. It's been really interesting. And I was quite taken aback, because my view of Livingstone was perhaps more akin to what we've been expressing in the first part of this evening. But he really is revered in Malawi, and revered right through different strata of society. And I think one thing that has resonance there is his own life story. His own life story was of one that is almost mimics most people in Malawi's life story now, which is a very limited access to education, but education being seen as the way to get on, and personal ambition driving that. And I found there's a lot of interest in any knowledge of Livingstone's life when we've visited Malawi. So the college is a big part of the Scotland-Malawi partnership. And I think one of the great joys of that has been this, I hope, growing mutually respectful view between Malawi and Scotland, and not white saviorism, but the Malawi-Scotland partnership is a big part of Malawi and civic society now, and a growing mutually respectful partnership. And in that, I think, I can't give you the quote precisely, you guys are the archivists and the experts, but there is a quote from Livingstone about how he believed that Europeans and Africans could work together as equals. And that was a very revolutionary thought in his lifetime. So no matter what involvement there was of his contemporaries in the slave trade, that was a revolutionary thought. And I think that's much respected today.
Thanks, Mike.
I think that, sorry, I just think it's interesting because I know I had read about that and about David Livingstone's ideologies, which were around, you know, okay, I'm here as a missionary, I'm here to do this work, I'm here to do that, but if African people don't want to get involved in this, we should still, you know, that should be okay. But there still was that issue about Christianity being the most powerful religion. So I think I still think there's still issues. I don't mean with particularly with David Livingstone, the person, because don't know him. You know, all we do is read about him. I still think there's definitely power dynamic issues that we have. You know, coming from this country to places like Malawi, I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. So while we do think we have good intentions, we really do at times have to ask ourselves, you know, who's winning out of this relationship and who's winning out of these conversations.
It's a really interesting thing because there's also the other aspect of very much what you've just said, which is that I've spoken to a couple of expert advisory panels, and it seems in some ways that Scotland has chosen Malawi. And there are other countries such as Zambia. We've started doing work with a museum in Zambia at the Trust to try and see if we can share our expertise with them to help them develop as an institutional site. And people from Zimbabwe asking, why have you focused on Malawi? There are these other countries that Livingstone also went through, Botswana, and you know, what reason this one country? Is it just because it's easiest, because we've already done it? You know, there's a complacency sometimes to some partnerships which do need to be challenged, not because those partnerships are bad, but because there are other things that we can be doing as well.
I'll move on to the next question because we do have a few in the chat. So there's a question from Peter Benny saying, how much of the Livingstone image was constructed by Stanley and other journalists? Well, maybe one for you, Kate, maybe, I don't know.
Yes, well, see, Stanley's an interesting one. You know, when deciding that Livingstone was a father figure to him and gave him the support and love that he never had, which is powerful for someone that you spent a relatively short period of time with and then left. So that hagiography you can see from the very beginning. Whilst the missionary travels that we are presented with was not what Livingstone originally wrote, he was willing to accept a lot of the amendments that were made to missionary travels because he was aware that his reputation and how he would be perceived was going to be implicitly tied to this book. So he projected an image, and famously the consular cap is part of that. And so he was aware of how he was being represented. And then it becomes quite confusing because you have Stanley's Dr. Livingstone, I presume, and that's something that we will never be able to ascertain whether he actually said that because that page is ripped out of his journal. Creating this narrative of this lost man with this desire to save an entire continent, and it takes some of what Livingstone thought about himself and just adds to it. So it's not that Livingstone didn't think these things, but it's just he possibly didn't think them quite to the degree that was subsequently embellished. And it's that classic question as well. Was he knelt by the side of his bed because he was in so much pain and leaning over, or was he knelt by the side of his bed in prayer, which is the nicer version for people to think of, not the fact that he was in such horrific pain because of the piles and the diarrhea that he couldn't lie flat. Sorry, I didn't mean to, but yes.
That's okay. It's a college event, so there's always going to be some medical detail in there that is going to make people slightly uncomfortable. That's fine. Another question then, just before, which I think will be the last one, and I just was going to say, if anyone else has any further questions that arise after the event, please do email us at library@rcpsg.ac.uk. And also the event will be on the college's website and YouTube channel and so on fairly soon, so you can watch it and ask other questions then. So we're really keen to keep up the discussion after the event. There's another question from Kira King. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Reframed events, how they came together at the college? So I can very quickly just talk about that. And really it was very much just about kind of practically looking at our collections in a different way. I think it started when we were looking at collections, archive collections like our college minutes. And we were seeing things in the college minutes about the college's history of gender inequality, and how that was perpetuated throughout a long period of the college's history. And it was how it was evidenced in the minutes, but it had never really been looked at in that way. So we were looking at it and thinking, we're looking, by doing this, and by us I mean me and the team, Claire, Kirsty and Morven, who are on the call tonight, looking at these records and realising that we were looking at them in a different way than what we had done before. And we thought, we can do this with so many other parts of our heritage and our collections, but wouldn't it be better to do it in a way where we're having a discussion with people from outside of the organisation as well, and in a public space, so that it's a more open process and people can join in? Because we started off with the view of, we don't necessarily know what we're going to find when we look at things in a different way. We don't necessarily know the answer, but we want to do it anyway. So we just kind of jumped in and started doing the events. So that gives a bit of background on that. Hopefully that answers that question. Are there any other questions or final comments from any of the panel either?
I think just to reiterate that this is the start of a very long process. And the more we have these conversations, the more comfortable we are having these conversations, and the more we start to actually bring in all the interested parties, so the museums in Malawi and Zimbabwe and South Africa and Botswana, and start talking to other institutional professionals about how they're dealing with their own critical catalogue.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Kate. Our next Reframed event, just quickly before we log off, is on the 29th of April, on a Thursday. That will feature Dr. Urania Varsu from the Anatomy Unit at the University of Glasgow, and she'll be talking to us about the female body in medical education, and issues of representation and consent. So that event will be on the website and you can book onto that. So 29th of April, so please do join us. So the last thing I want to do is just thank again, really sincerely, Zandra, Elena and Kate. Really appreciate you joining us for this event tonight, and also thanks for the audience for joining us and for some really good questions as well. Please do keep them coming. So all the very best from us, and have a great night. See you later.